Good morning. Welcome to my thought for the day. Good to see you. I hope you're well today. I'm looking at these lovely verses in the middle of Lamentations. Lamentations is a book that isn't read very often. It's very sad. It's all about the destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple and its destruction. And the writer writes beautiful Hebrew poetry, which you can study. But he's talked about so much sadness, so much horror, so much disaster. And in verse 19 of chapter 3, he says, "Remember my affliction and my bitterness, the wormwood and the gall. Everything is bitter, every thought is bitter. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me." And then in verse 21 he says, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." And it was verse 21 that really struck me. I mean, the very familiar verses set to several hymns that we know. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies, they're new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. That wonderful hymn, Great is thy faithfulness, is based on these verses. But it's verse 21. Here he is in the middle of Jeremiah, who traditionally wrote these verses, had lived through years of warning the people under the direction of God, warning them to change their ways, telling them what was coming. And nobody listened. Nobody took any notice of Jeremiah. They treated him abysmally and ignored everything he said. And the last thing he would have wanted was what happened. He wanted to change it. He wanted to avert disaster. He wasn't pleased that his foretellings about Jerusalem had come into reality. He wasn't pleased at all. He was heartbroken. And my soul thinks continually of it as bowed down within me. The wormwood and the gall, everything was bitter. Everything was sadness. He was mourning. He was in a terribly heartbroken state. But then verse 21 of chapter 3, he says, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." And that's what we need to do when we're in the middle of a difficult situation, when something awful has happened. And my goodness, this that had happened in Jeremiah's life was awful. You can almost not imagine anything worse. When the dreadful thing has happened, we have the opportunity to call to mind, to remember, to think about the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. When we're in the middle of the terrible situation, we have the opportunity of remembering God's goodness, God's promises, God's love, God's commitment, God's faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Because Jeremiah realized that it was not down to God that disaster had come upon Jerusalem. It was down to the behavior and actions of the people involved. And this is what we have in our world. We live in a fallen world. A world, a world full of sinfulness. A world full of selfish people doing selfish things, putting themselves, their ideas, their plans ahead of anything that God might be saying to them. We live in a world full of sin and evil and wickedness. And the only way God would be able to stop it would be if he turned us all into robots who had no free will And he's not about to do that. That was never his plan. And giving us free will has led to the world as it is. None of it is what God would have wanted. So we had to be careful to attribute to God. Jeremiah never attributed to God the destruction of Jerusalem. It was down to the people. It was down to the sinfulness. And Daniel, when Daniel was asking the Lord, when is this exile going to end? When can we go home to Jerusalem? He was repenting for the actions of the people that had led to the fall of Jerusalem. God told them, warned them, told them, warned them by all his prophets, and nobody listened. And that people who live today, if they know anything about the Bible, they know that the things that are approved of today are not approved of in the Bible. They know, and they choose to ignore the warnings. And when we ignore the warnings, we do so at our own peril. But it doesn't change the fact that God has a steadfast love towards all that he's made. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. This I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. So whatever situation you have been facing or you are facing, choose to remember, to call to mind the goodness of God, the love of God, the devotion of God, the fellowship of God, the presence of God in your life, the salvation of God through Jesus, the love of God. His steadfast love never ceases. They are new every morning. His mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. It's very personal. God is in the difficulty with you, loving you, supporting you, wanting you to turn to him for help. And he will be there for you. He has always been there for you, and he always will be there for you. Lamentations 3:21. But this I call to mind, therefore I have hope. There is no hope outside of God. That's my thought for the day. I'll see you again tomorrow. God bless. Bye-bye.